a production of Swan Bitcoin. Swan Signal is a weekly show that pairs up great guests for compelling discussions about Bitcoin and economics. I'm your host, Brady Swenson, Head of Education at Swan. But before we dive in, a quick word about the service we provide here at Swan. We've built the best way to accumulate Bitcoin with automatic recurring buys. It's a very simple setup. One, you just connect your bank account to AutoFund USD. Two, we automatically stack for you. Three, you can set up automatic withdrawals to your wallets. We do all this with very low fees in the industry, up to 80% lower than than Coinbase, absolutely crushing Coinbase, and up to 57% lower than Cash App for automatic recurring purchases. And today I have some big news for you all. We are launching our daily buys beta. We've had a huge demand to add daily buys to our weekly, bi-monthly, and monthly purchase frequencies. And so we're about to roll that out. You can sign up at swanbitcoin.com. Just add your email address, click get started to be added to the beta list, or you can DM us on Twitter at swanbitcoin. We have about 400 out of our 1,000 daily buys beta slots filled up. So get in there. All right. I'm really excited to welcome our guest to the show today. First, we have the inimitable Saifedean Ammous with us today. He's author of a staple of the Bitcoin canon, of course, the Bitcoin Standard, and he's an economics educator and researcher. You can find Saif's work at saifedean.com. Saif, welcome to the show, man.
Thank you very much for having me. It's always fun to join you, Brady.
All right. And we have finance and wealth management YouTuber, host of the Rebel Capitalist Show, and investor George Gammon with us today as well. You can subscribe to George's channel at youtube.com/George Gammon. Gammon is Gammon. Welcome, George. How's it go today?
Doing very well. Thank you very much. I appreciate you having me on the show.
Really appreciate your time. Okay, let's dive in and get started with the big news from yesterday that Bitcoin Twitter is abuzz about. The news that MicroStrategy announced that they made a $250 million Bitcoin purchase. BlackRock, the largest asset manager in the world, and Vanguard, the largest provider of mutual funds in the world, both hold a significant stake in MicroStrategy. The two of them together hold over 25%. So it seems likely that they had prior notice of this buy. And if so, that means that these two financial behemoths just essentially approved a massive Bitcoin buy. The MicroStrategy stock price is up around 15% on the news. So that means I'm sure that other CEOs are taking notice. We've also seen in the past few months, big macro investors are publicly announcing their Bitcoin positions. Paul Tudor Jones, Raoul Pal, Lynn Alden, who we had on the show recently. And for instance, Raoul Pal recently tweeted that Bitcoin is the future and is wildly underpriced. So George, let's start with you on this one. What do you think of these developments and their implications for Bitcoin?
Well, I'd have to go with Lynn Alden. She's my partner in Rebel Capitalist Pro. So anything she says, I'm definitely going to go along with, because she is definitely one of the smartest people I have ever met in my life, without exception. But I think the best information I can give you is just some insider information right here from St. Bart's. And I came here maybe 3 weeks ago because I wanted to find a place in the world where I could just go to the gym, where I could go to the beach, where things were as close to normal as you could find. And if your viewers or your listeners have never been to St. Bart's, it's right in the Caribbean. It's basically like Monaco. So there's 9,000 people on this little island, and it's extremely affluent. And I would say, 90% of the people here are in finance. They're hedge fund managers, they're investment bankers, they're straight from Wall Street. This is the group that you were basically just mentioning. And I've gone to several social gatherings, let's say. And, you're having drinks with the guys, just saying, what do you do? And I'm not going to mention any names, but a lot of the people that I've met here, you'd recognize from CNBC, you'd recognize from Bloomberg. And I would say pretty much every single one of them that I spoke with after a few drinks, we ended up talking about Bitcoin. And so you can take that for what it's worth. And I don't really know what's going on as far as the news. I don't know what's going on with this company or BlackRock, but I do know that every hedge fund manager I'm talking to here in St. Bart's after a couple drinks, that's where the conversation goes.
Great. Tell them about my book.
Yeah, it's a great place to start for sure. It's widely recommended. Safe. What are the implications here for Bitcoin? I've got a follow up after this, but I'd like to hear just your initial thoughts.
I think it's it's quite significant because a lot of people have spent the last few years discussing Bitcoin from the perspective of payments and retail adoption. And the idea was, when am I going to be able to pay for my coffee or for my McDonald's from with Bitcoin? And the point that I made in my book in the Bitcoin Standard is that Bitcoin is not competing with Visa, with MasterCards, with all these payment methods. Bitcoin is not an alternative to these things. It doesn't compete with them. It's orthogonal to them. You can install all of those things on top of Bitcoin. Bitcoin is competing with the actual assets that are being traded on these networks. It's competing with the currencies, with the national currencies, and with gold as a form of money and as a store of value. And I think this development bears it out, and it's of course it's absolutely massive. It's $250 million of Bitcoin, which is not chump change. I mean, it's a large company that makes about $500 million of revenue a year, and it's a company that has a significant cash balance. And it has reached the conclusion that the best thing for us to do with a significant part of our cash balance is to hold some Bitcoin. And somebody dug up their, I think it was the investor letter from a few weeks or a few months ago, where they had discussed, or if it was, I'm not sure if it was a conference call or the letter, but they discussed their cash position, and they said, our outlook on our cash position is becoming negative now because of all of the developments of the last 3 months with the coronavirus lockdowns and so on. And they have a negative outlook on their cash position, and now we see that they've acted upon that, and they've replaced their part of their holdings of US dollar cash with Bitcoin. And I think a lot of people are going to see the benefit of this. And I think really this is how Bitcoin adoption happens. Bitcoin is going to become part of people's cash balances. And if it continues to work, if it continues to operate, and it continues to appreciate, it's going to become an increasingly significant part of other people's cash balances, particularly as other currencies continue to lose value more and more over time. So the phenomenon I describe in my book is that in the long run, value accrues to the hardest money. And I think, micro systems recognizing that, I think I find it to be very exciting, because it'll be interesting to see what happens when more companies do that. I mean, if we look at Bitcoin's average performance over the last 10 years, I think it's gone up. Last time I ran the numbers, it was maybe 500 or 400% per year on average. So if Bitcoin has an average year for Bitcoin next year, every company is going to pay attention, because this move is likely to end up being more profitable than anything else that the company has done. And I think that just shows the value proposition for investing in an alternative to central banks. The market is telling the world, invest in this central bank alternative. It works well.
Yeah, I think that
Go ahead, George.
I'm sorry, I don't know the format here, but just to dovetail on that thought, I think going back to the people that I'm speaking with, who are the professionals, short term, I think it's more of a speculation. And I don't really see gold as competing with Bitcoin or silver, just because I see them as two completely separate asset classes. I would never buy Bitcoin for the reasons I buy gold, and vice versa, because gold to me is just an insurance policy. It's not a way to get rich, it's a way to stay rich. And with Bitcoin, it's a fantastic asymmetric speculation. So I just see them as two completely separate things. Now, that said, I think long term, what you were saying with your book is really interesting, because you're talking about how in the long run, everything goes into hard currencies or hard money, like we've seen in the past with gold. And when you were saying that, it reminded me of Gresham's law. And if Brady, if your viewers aren't familiar with Gresham's law, it's basically the bad money chases out good money. So let's use an example of ancient Rome or some society where they used physical gold coins. And when they get over indebted, what happens is the president or king or whomever says, okay, well, we'll just solve this problem by making these new coins, and we'll just paint them gold, but really they're nickel or they're copper or something like that. You know what I mean? They're trying to pull the wool over your eyes, and they issue more and more of this currency, we'll call it, but everyone knows it's fake. So the more they issue these currencies, the more the real gold coins come out of circulation, because smart people see the value, they see the intrinsic value, and they start hoarding all of the real money. It's Gresham's law.
Yeah.
And over the long term, I'm not saying it's happening today, but it could happen with Bitcoin. It's a very interesting concept.
Yeah, but I think the nickel coins are nowhere to be found today, but gold coins are still around today. So I think Gresham's law talks about the which coins will be used for legal, commercial, and transactions in the country, and the answer is, clearly in Venezuela today, everybody wants to spend their bolivars if they can, but nobody wants to take them. So officially, yes, the bolivar has driven out the US dollar because it is the worst money many, many times over. But in reality, the bolivar continues to drop further and further and further. And any actual real wealth that exists in Venezuela is stored in the US dollar or in Bitcoin or in gold. So, it's misinterpreted by Keynesians to suggest that, oh, if it's an easy money, then it's just going to win out over the harder money. Well, no, it's going to win out because people are just going to get rid of it. But eventually, it's not going to be money very quickly because it's going to just lose its value quickly, and eventually the harder money will remain.
Yeah, I think that's my point. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is effectively what's happening with Bitcoin, and you're right in that it is an asymmetric bet now, but it's an asymmetric bet where the positive upside outcome is that it becomes something like gold. It stops being an asymmetric bet. It becomes just the predominant monetary asset. Yeah. And we're at least 100x away from there, or maybe 50x away from there, or 1000x away from there. God knows how much more bull run we have to get there. But Bitcoin keeps going up. It eats everything else. Not saying it will happen, but it hasn't looked like it's been stoppable over the last 10 years. So we'll see.
Yeah, I'm sure you guys have done the math. I'd be curious to know how much the price of Bitcoin would have to go up in order for it to be equivalent to the market value of gold, or the market cap of gold.
It's at about the price of one gold bar, like the 12.5 kilogram, 400 ounce bar. So basically, one Bitcoin would be worth about 400 ounces of gold.
Yeah, the math I'd like to do is figure out how much gold is in the world right now.
I think it's about 170,000 tons.
Yeah, so then how much is that in dollar terms? And then figure out how much Bitcoin would have to go up to equal that amount.
It's about, I think it's about $10 trillion at this point. If I'm running gold is about $10 trillion. Yeah. Because it's about 180,000 tons, and then 1 kilogram is, I think, around $60,000 or something.
Yeah.
I think you multiply these, you end up with around 10 trillion. It's in that ballpark. So Bitcoin is around 200 billion so far. So
yeah, I think that's your upside.
Yeah. Exactly. 2% of gold.
And that's
2%. That's not the upside, actually. That's just one way station on the one base camp on the real launch, because that's just gold right now in a world in which all kinds of other monetary assets are used, because gold is not allowed to be in a free market. If we could have a free market of money, I believe gold would win, and everybody would be using monetary instruments backed with gold.
Good point.
But and in that case, probably gold would be worth a lot more than what it is today, because we wouldn't have all these national currencies. So there's also that. So gold, and then there's the national currencies. And then there's the question of how much of the store of value market in the world, how much of the financial markets in the world, and the art market and the real estate market is actually just store of value demand that could better be replicated by just going into Bitcoin. How many people are just buying houses and real estate investments, not because they want to own houses, but because they want to store their wealth. And so you think that could lead to potentially more stuff for Bitcoin to eat as it rises.
Another fantastic point. I do a lot of business in South America, and I've been doing so since, call it 2014. And for the Americans or people in more developed economies, they might not get this. But in South America, I mean, I'm going to call it almost 100% of the population stores their wealth in real estate. That's just what you do. I mean, when I was in Ecuador, even the poor people in the fishing villages, if they earned an extra even $100,000, what they do is they just build another 10 or 20 square feet on their house, and they just keep building and building and building and building. And the same thing in Medellin, Colombia, where I've been doing real estate since 2015. I would say, and I had the numbers for this, but almost like 90% of the apartments that are owned there are owned just outright. There's no mortgage on them because people really don't have savings accounts there. They don't, their currency hasn't been a store of value at all. It's lost a lot more than the dollar a lot faster. So for them, their house, their apartment, their property, their finca, it's a store of value. It's their savings account. So I think you just hit the nail on the head there. Very interesting point.
Yeah, I think in my book, I argue basically Bitcoin is the most advanced technology for saving that we've ever invented because it's strictly scarce. You know, even gold was the most advanced because gold, by nature of its chemistry, it can never increase at more than 1 or 2% per year. But Bitcoin is even more advanced because in a few years it's going to go below gold's growth rate and eventually it drops to zero. So it's the one liquid asset that we have in the world that is strictly scarce. There's never going to be more than 21 million. That's it. And when you think about it this way, you know, there's no better thing in which if you want to store value in the future, this offers in my mind, the explanation for why we've seen so much gains in Bitcoin. And I think as long as this continues, the case is arguably very strong that this is quite useful as a store of values simply because nobody can make more of it. We've had 10 years, 11 years of this thing running, and nobody managed to find a way of making 1 Bitcoin more than what should be made in the schedule by this block height. And I think that's an astonishing invention, really. Just thinking about it, it's almost Robert Breedlove on Twitter compares this to the invention of zero. It's a mental construct. Once we've invented, it changes the way that we can do math just by thinking of zero. And in a sense, inventing this first strictly scarce asset just changes the way that we deal with scarcity and with storing value and with saving for the future. It's an astonishing idea.
I would even take it a step further, in that I don't even think it's a fixed number of Bitcoin. I think it's a decreasing number.
Yeah,
we as human beings are always going to lose them. And that may be a crude way of looking at it, but yeah, there might be 21 million, but sure, next year there's going to be, maybe 20.5. And as the years go on, you lose more and more and more of them. And so it's a scarce asset as is that becomes more and more scarce just because us clumsy human beings are just going to lose our thumb drive or who knows what we'll do.
we call those donations, George.
Okay.
It's philanthropy. Deflationary philanthropy.
Yeah. Right.
So, Saif, I want to circle back to this idea of, monetary premiums in, other assets, especially real estate. So how much do you think that the monetary, premiums in these, actually hard assets drives wealth inequality or inequality of access to these assets that are needed?
I think it's quite significant because it makes the market for people who are looking for homes. It's not just young people who are looking to leave their parents' home and start their own family and have their own home. On top of that, you have all the people who already have a house but are looking for a savings account that can't be confiscated through capital controls and inflation by their government. And so it's instead of the people in Latin America, instead of putting money in a bank account or a stock market or something that some advanced technology for saving like Bitcoin, they end up having to buy a new apartment. So you see this all over the world. So many apartments are empty or are owned by people that are renting them out, and it's increased demand. Most people have no business speculating in the real estate business. Like this should be something that is provided by professionals who have expertise in this business. If you're a doctor, you're not providing any value to the real estate business by investing in real estate properties. And I think in a healthy financial system, what you're looking for in terms of savings, you would save you would keep in a decent saving vehicle like gold or Bitcoin, and then what you're looking to invest, you'd invest in things in which you have some kind of specific edge that allows you to understand probably your own business. You'd open your own clinic, your own practice. Or some business that you have some expertise with. But I think this notion that everybody needs to be a real estate speculator just so that they can retire is, in my mind, massive inefficiency in the housing market. And I think we'd have cheaper houses available for people if it was just the people if the people bidding for houses were only the people who are looking for houses to live in, to buy, and if credit for housing wasn't so easy to get, houses would be far cheaper.
I mean, I think that's a huge point that I hope everyone just understands. And I would take it and say all financial assets. And if you go back to 1913, let's take it back to 1930. And if you look at a chart of inflation from 1930 to today, you see that every single year it's just pretty much going up. We've got a few years that just goes down a fraction. It might stay the same, but it's just up, 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 up. Take it prior to 1930, and you see that inflation and deflation was more like a heartbeat. It would go up, it would go down, it would go up, it would go down. And most of the time it stayed pretty consistent. And if you look at the 1800s as an example, the late 1800s, we had about 3% deflation per year. Yeah. So the price of goods and services were going down. Now, most people, especially Keynesians, would have a heart attack and say, oh my gosh, that must have been the most horrible time in history. But it wasn't. We had nominal GDP growth and we had nominal wages increase. We also had about 4% nominal rates. So you could put your money in a bank back then and you could get a 7% real return. So you didn't need to speculate on real estate or in the stock market or in bonds. But now that we have a 2 or 3% per year inflation, and I would argue that it's higher, going back to 1980, you don't have a choice. The average Joe and Jane, whether they know it consciously or subconsciously, they realize that if they keep their money in the bank, they're never going to be able to retire. The only thing that the way that you get ahead is you buy a home, or you take and you put as much money as you possibly can in your 401k to go in the stock market. And then maybe, just maybe, you'll have enough money to retire. Yeah. But if you think about it, that's because we have lived in a state of inflation where those currency units are losing value every single day. If they were gaining in value every single day, it's the complete opposite. And I would go so far as to say it would not only alleviate the misallocation of resources through just pure speculation of the overall economy, but it would make society so much better, because people, they just, as an example, a McDonald's worker, let's say they're making $1,500 a month, their expenses are $1,500 a month. If you take and run that math over 20 years at 3% deflation and a 1% raise in their nominal wages, at the end of the 20 years, they're making $1,800 a month doing the same job flipping burgers. If they don't get a raise, if they don't get a promotion, and you say, well, George, that's only a $300 raise over 20 years. Right. But their expenses have gone from $1,500 down to $800. You see, so now there's $1,000 delta right there, and they have $1,000 every single month of disposable income. They've gotten richer just as a result of letting the free market do its job, create goods and services at lower and lower prices. And
absolutely, that's all music to my ears. I mean, people don't get the idea that, economics is not a rat race. Economics is we produce stuff and then that makes life better for us. And really, by burning the value of our money, we're making it so that every person has every person is constantly watching. The alternative is that you're just going to watch your wealth be dissipated. So you have no reason to save. You have no reason to think about the future. Your focus is going to be about what can I do with this money right now. And so that destroys the incentive for saving. In fact, think about it, with the hard money that appreciates at 1 or 2 or 3%, children could start getting their birthday gifts in small little sums of money, and then they can start watching them appreciate over time. From the age of 3, 5, 10, you start saving and you watch them appreciating. And it makes sense that, you'd work little jobs in the summer. As a kid, you do a little bit of work here and there, and you could see people actually saving up from their own money, and with the help of some savings, some work, and some deflation, it's not impossible to imagine that any normal person working any kind of menial job, given the technological capacity of our society today, it's normal that people should be able to afford normal and decent homes with 24-hour electricity and running hot water. It's just something that is so cheap to produce, given our technological capacities today, that really any burger flipper should be able to afford it. Like if you spend 8 hours a day flipping burgers, that's an extremely valuable thing. You should be able to afford saving up to that. After a few years, you should be able to afford to buy a house. I think it would be something that would be taken for granted in this world. And for most of for most of the 19th century, you're right. People could save. People had that ethic of saving. They had that idea that you put your money aside and you save and you watch it grow. And now that's completely replaced with the idea that no, you just continue to spend, and all of your life you spend, and then when you have major expenses, you just take out a loan and you get into debt. And then the more income you get, the bigger debt you can take on.
Yeah, also too, and it's ironic that we've got the people in the central bank, all these PhDs, that see inflation as the solution, right? They see it as the solution to everyone's problems instead of looking at it as the cause of the problem.
Absolutely.
If we could just get people to rearrange their thinking and say, okay, wait a minute, if all this additional government spending, let's say through welfare, this creates inflation. It creates this additional money supply. Now, whether that comes out in the CPI due to velocity, that's a whole nother story. But you're increasing the money supply through this, the debt monetization of the Fed. And let's say they're spending it on welfare. That's the solution that as a society we look to, where the government just has to spend more money. The government just has to provide health care or whatever. But if we turned it on its head, so to speak, and said, well, if we just go back to deflation, we don't need the government to solve all these problems, which they just make worse. That society could handle it on their own because they've got a hard money that stays consistent or appreciates over time. And, listen, if that's where Bitcoin can take us, then I think everyone should be on board. And philosophically, I don't think anyone is more aligned with Bitcoin than I am. Whether it pans out, only time will tell. But I think if you understand really the ramifications for society at large, to have a currency or a store of value that's scarce, that's limited, I mean, you almost solve every single problem that we have, at least in the developed economies today.
Yeah, a lot of people make fun of Bitcoiners because one of the things that we're always saying is whatever problem there is, Bitcoin fixes this. But really, if we do manage to put central banks out of business and replace them with a form of software where everybody in the world can have access to a hard money that they could save in, really, that's going to fix an enormous amount of problems all over the world.
It's all about hard money. It
really is.
Whether it's gold, whether it's Bitcoin, whether you want to price in oil, I don't, whatever you want to do, as long as you got that hard money, that's what it's all about.
Yeah, but oil is not a hard money. And
I'm just saying you use anything you want. I don't care what you plug into the equation, as long as.
I mean, the reason gold was used is because it is hard. But I think the interesting thing about Bitcoin is that it gets over the one limitation of gold, which is that gold is physical and clunky to move around. Bitcoin is native to the internet, so there's no physical asset to it anywhere. There's nothing in the world that is a physical manifestation of Bitcoin that is needed for Bitcoin to operate. And so it exists purely digitally. And so it can travel around the world very fast, very cheap. That's the really powerful thing about it. And so far, the past 11 years, we don't really have time to get into the technical details, but it's, judging by results, we've had 11 years in which the supply has not been inflated by anybody or corrupted by anybody. That's the really interesting thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Brett. Do you have another question there, buddy? I was going to.
No, go ahead, man. Go ahead.
This
is great.
How you guys reconcile the advancement of Bitcoin? Let's say that it triples in value. Let's say it quadruples in value. To now, all of a sudden, it's a competitor where the government really sees this as competing with the dollar. And I understand that they can't ban it from a standpoint that it's decentralized. I totally get that. But they make it illegal to where the consequences of being caught, although very few people actually do get caught, but the consequences are so extreme that it prevents people from using it or holding it or want to. How do we get around that with Bitcoin?
I mean, first of all, there's no promises and no guarantees. So obviously, this is a risk that any investor needs to assume and assess on their own. But I would say first of all, the fact that trying to pass a ban like this is highly unlikely to succeed is, you can see it from the fact that you can still get drugs in pretty much any major city in the world, even though drugs are illegal, and even though drugs need to be physically produced and processed and transported and sold, and yet you can still secure them. So Bitcoin requires people to just run code on their computers, and it can be encrypted. And with modern, of course, there'll always be surveillance mechanisms, but there are always ways to get around them. It's a complicated cat and mouse game, but I think ultimately it's very hard to ban it, and I think it seems that we at some point it might even be ridiculous that we're discussing this, because it's been 11 years now, and some governments have issued recommendations against it here and there, but practically we haven't seen any kind of real clampdown or crackdown on Bitcoin. And it's getting to a point where it's entering into the mainstream. And I think, the way that I look at it is that, in a sense, this is a superior technology. And this is a point that I make repeatedly in my talks, in that people think about this as if it's just, like a new gimmick, whether they'll let us adopt it or they won't let us adopt it. But I think it's better to think about it as something like dynamite. So when you've invented dynamite, governments can make it illegal, but, the smarter ones would rather have the dynamite themselves, And I think this is the case with Bitcoin. I think the ultimate security of Bitcoin rests not on maybe the technical specifications, but it rests on the fact that it's going to be compelling as an economic option for everybody, including people in government. And I think we see this increasingly. Members of Congress are open about the fact that they hold Bitcoin, and we see more and more financial institutions getting into it. It's more likely that people, once they understand the implications of Bitcoin, it's more likely that they would want to be on the side of Bitcoin rather than fighting it, because fighting it is extremely expensive, and it has an extremely high opportunity cost, because if you failed, you could have spent all that time and money on securing yourself more of the scarce Bitcoin pie. So I think, incidentally, I think the point where I started really paying attention to Bitcoin was when it in 2013, when it didn't really collapse after the Silk Road incident. After that was shut down and Bitcoin continued to operate. And later on, I remember hearing something about from one of the investigators, where she, I think, said something along the lines of, initially my intuition was, once I started learning about Bitcoin, my initial intuition was, all right, we should just shut this thing down. But then as I dug into it, I thought to myself, no, we should use this to identify the drug dealers and to work with them. And Interestingly enough, and I've heard several stories of this, both in person to talking to people as well as reading about them. Interestingly enough, that same investigator ended up also working in Bitcoin and holding Bitcoin and using it. And now she works in some Bitcoin companies as well. So I think there's this allure to hard money that I think if you clearly obviously understand the value proposition of gold, and in a sense, if you understand gold and you see Bitcoin as digital gold, it starts to make sense that people don't want to ban gold. They want to get their hands on it. So if they're banning it, they're probably taking it away from you so that they would have it, rather than banning it because they don't want to touch it. Because it's really scarce. And if it's banned, I'd rather have it banned while I possess it rather than take my chances and not own it because I can't get it back again because of its scarcity.
Yeah, I see what has happened. Let's just say since we can go back a long time, but let's just take recently what has happened 2020 with the coronavirus and the Fed coming in and doing limitless quantitative easing, committing to $1 trillion a day in repo, just taking their balance sheet from under 4 trillion up to 7 trillion, and or war. I mean, let's Bitcoin would prevent them from going into war, which I'm all about. I think everyone would be in favor of that, except for the people that in politics that gain political power through going to war and doing all of these what I would consider nefarious things. But I think that it's just, if we were to say, okay, listen, we want to use this Bitcoin that takes away the power of the central bank to increase the money supply, and it eliminates the warfare state, it eliminates the welfare state. I don't think governments are going to, or at least the United States governments and the developed economies are going to jump on board with that. But what I do think is interesting, if we get to a point where, if Bitcoin rises in value that much, then my guess is there's going to be a lot of skepticism at that time, even more so than today, with fiat currencies. And one thing that I've looked into just recently, because of how hard it is to travel right now, and I don't even want to go into the story of me trying to get from Medellin, Colombia, just to St. Bart's. I mean, it was like a Mission Impossible movie with Tom Cruise. I mean, it was just crazy having to get a humanitarian flight out of Medellin to Fort Lauderdale. Then in Fort Lauderdale, I couldn't get a COVID test in time to get to St. Bart's, because everywhere in the Caribbean right now, you have to have a negative test that had been taken within 3 days. And in Florida, when I was there, the fastest you could get the results was 5 days. So effectively, you've got a Berlin Wall around Florida right there if you're trying to get even somewhere like Puerto Rico. So I had to fly from Fort Lauderdale to St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands just to get a COVID test. I could get it in 24 hours or 48 hours, and then go, once I got the test done, then go to Puerto Rico, then down to St. Bart's on a semi-charter flight. I mean, it was insanity. But my point is, I'm like, okay, I'm in the process right now of getting my Colombian passport to have dual citizenship. But I've looked into some of these Caribbean islands. Now, the passports in these islands right now, as an example, St. Kitts, St. Lucia, the ones that you always hear about that are actually very good passports, they're a fraction of the price of what they were prior to COVID, because all of their revenues are decreasing. So they have to lower their prices to compete with other countries that are selling these passports. So fast forward, or go back to what I was saying about Bitcoin and the lack of confidence in fiat currency. Maybe if we have a United States, Japan that takes those draconian measures because they want to keep the warfare and the welfare state alive and well, and give the Federal Reserve the power to create money supply, or at least base money supply, or M2, who knows where it goes in the future. But maybe there'll be other countries that say, hey, listen, what we'll do is we'll go and we'll use Bitcoin. Like Puerto Rico right now with Act 20 and 22. I know a lot of Bitcoin guys have gone there for that. So what Puerto Rico is doing is saying, hey, guys, come here and spend your money. We'll take Bitcoin, or we'll lower your taxes. We'll do whatever needs to be done to encourage you to come here and create jobs, create businesses, do these things. So maybe if you're, a country that's an emerging market and you're saying, hey, how do we get out of our debt problem? How do we save our economy? I know what we'll do. We'll take Bitcoin, guys. Come here, bring all your money, bring on all your wealth, bring your human capital, bring your brain power, your experience. Come here and create a tech industry, create businesses, create jobs. I think that's where it could go. Also, too, if central banks, and you guys would know this a heck of a lot better than I would, but a few people that I've talked to recently that know the Bitcoin space have kind of gone over this hypothesis when I was interviewing them about if central banks start bringing Bitcoin on and using that as an asset on their balance sheet, a little bit like they do with gold. So then if you had the central banks that were kind of giving it the green light, although it might not become and replace their hallowed fiat currency, it becomes more adopted. And then you kind of have that boiling of the frog effect with Bitcoin, boiling the frog being the politicians, the federal government, and the central bank of that nation. They just gradually adopt it. So yeah. I that kind of goes along with what you're saying, but that's kind of where I find the argument very interesting against what I brought up initially with the government's just not wanting to lose power over the printing press and just saying, you know what, Bitcoin's illegal.
Yeah, and I think, go ahead.
I want to steer this into a certain direction. Excuse me. So the irony that you were trying to point out, George, was that, government interventions under the guise of, trying to fix certain problems in society, and the vast majority of them, were caused by this singular intervention that we all know as the government, take over control of money. And as you say, this is how Safe says, Bitcoiners have this meme and Bitcoin fixes this. Safe, in your book, you write that human civilization flourished in times and places where sound money was widely adopted, whereas unsound money all too frequently coincided with civilizational decline and societal collapse. So, question on the table now: how do you guys see the path toward a better society unfolding, given that we transition to a Bitcoin-based economy? And what lessons might we be able to draw from historical transitions between, global currencies? Safe, you want to start on this one?
Sure. So generally, as a little disclaimer, my friends will probably let you know that I am the most optimistically delusional person, or delusionally optimistic person.
You must be a great entrepreneur.
It's best reflected in my support of my football team, where I've believed for every one of the last 30 years the Liverpool are going to win the league, and they never do. Of course, until this year, they've won it. So like now I guess. Fan, huh? I'm sorry.
Like being a Chicago Cubs fan.
Yeah, basically. So now perhaps my delusional optimism is not entirely misplaced, since it did work out eventually. And I think in this situation, I like to take the optimistic take that it's not going to necessarily, or Bitcoin is what's going to mean that this the collapse of government money is going to be less painful and less problematic. I think this is the way that I would like to think of it, in that when hyperinflation happens, the reason hyperinflation is terrible is not just because people lose money. It's not just because people lost their wealth. It's not just that everybody got an 80 or 90 or 99% haircut on their wealth. It's the fact that businesses are no longer working, shelves are empty, and economic production breaks down. Farmers can't grow food, and then food can't get to the shelves, and all of that stuff breaks down because money is no longer usable, because there's no longer money in society. And so that's the real catastrophe of hyperinflation, much more than just the financial losses that are attached to it. Now, in the case of Bitcoin, I'm slightly optimistic that perhaps what's going to happen is that because Bitcoin is available, as we witness, more and more of these hyperinflations around the world, more and more people will have access to Bitcoin. More and more people will be able to hedge against their national currencies with Bitcoin, hold a 5% position in Bitcoin, 10% position in Bitcoin, which could, end up being 50% of your net worth after a couple of years of national currency inflation and a couple of years of Bitcoin appreciation, 50 or even 90. So I think with this being there, it means that, and I don't think Bitcoin is yet at that point where the liquidity is large enough, but possibly in a few years, 10 years maybe, let's say, when more hyperinflationary cases like, say, Zimbabwe and Venezuela and Lebanon start happening, more and more people will have access to Bitcoin, and these things will start mattering less and less. And the way that I see it is, and I discuss this in my forthcoming book, The Fiat Standard, the Bitcoin is the way that we euthanize and get rid of the fiat standard peacefully and without too much bloodshed. We don't have to butcher it and risk it jumping and killing us while we're butchering it. Nobody needs to be reliant upon it, and as it starts to collapse, people can choose to opt out and use Bitcoin. And Bitcoin is better than gold in this regard because you can continue to use it internationally, whereas gold is much harder to use. So I'm going to go with the and I discuss this. I discuss all different scenarios in the book, but I'm maybe delusionally, but I'm optimistic that Bitcoin ends up being more of an upgrade of the financial software of the world rather than messy, cataclysmic Roman Empire collapse.
Well, I can tell you that if you can get some way to transact that gets around the SWIFT system that we have right now and around FATCA, the increase in global productivity would be enormous. I mean, we're talking about something that I think would be very much like the airplane. And let me explain. So
that's a great metaphor. Yeah, an
airplane. It would, let's say, to go from Phoenix to Las Vegas, let's just say we only had cars, right? So it takes you 6 hours. Well, that's 6 hours of your time. Well, if it only takes you an hour to fly, then that's 5 hours that you have saved that you could be doing. You could be producing goods and services. Well, times that by however many flights there are, however many hours we save as a result. I can tell you by doing so much business in South America and in Medellin that just getting my own money, that it's not someone else's. I'm not getting a loan. It's my money from the United States just down to Medellin to Colombia, and then take the dollars and then buy the pesos and put them in the bank and go to the paperwork and go to the reporting system and blah, 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 blah. And then you got to pay the spread to the bank, right, for doing the transfer. So think about how much money is flushed down the toilet right there, and then how much time is wasted. I mean, we're talking about billions and if not trillions of dollars a year. It's just completely wasted in economic output and productivity as a result of having to deal with something so cumbersome as the current dollar fiat system we have. And it's not just about the global reserve currency, just these green pieces of paper. What people have to understand, it's about the infrastructure. So that's why it's so hard to go from, let's say, the dollar to the euro or the yen or the won or something like that. It's not necessarily that it would be hard to change green pieces of paper for red pieces of paper.
No, but everybody's locked into the infrastructure and the KYC and all of that.
The infrastructure, but this infrastructure is very cumbersome. So to your point, if we could get this seamless way to transfer money. I remember the first time I spoke with my buddy Alex with Nuggets News. He made me, right when I was talking to him on the phone, I don't know if we were live or not, but he had me download this app on my wallet while I was talking to him. I think I still got it right here. It's this Wallet of Satoshi, and he told me to open it up like this. And I put it right up on the, in front of the camera there. And he transferred me $2 or $3 in Satoshis just through the little webcam thing. And I mean, to think about how hard that would have been if he would have tried to transfer me, let's say, $100,000 or something like that from Australia to where I was in Medellin, Colombia at the time. So, I mean, this is a huge advancement. It's really a game changer as far as global productivity. Also, what I wanted to say is you were talking about how the current system completely distorts the economy, and it creates this well, let me back up here. So it distorts the economy, but I would go so far as to take it even a step further back. So what I mean by this is we are talking about inflation distorting the economy, but if you look at government debt, it distorts the economy as well. And people say, well, yeah, but it's when the debt gets to a certain level. But what they don't realize is it's getting from A to B that really matters. And I think most people really don't get that. So let me give you an example. Like right now, the United States government is almost 50% of GDP. The government spending is over 50% of GDP. So that means that the private sector economy, or the productive part of the economy, is only 50%. Take that back before we had the Federal Reserve, and it was over 90% of the government was the actual private sector, that really produced the goods and services. So now, even if we could just eliminate all 26 trillion in debt, the problem is that our economy has been built around this government spending and these inefficiencies, just like Venezuela, using them as an example. You could solve all their debt problems, or the dollar denominated debt, but the problem is they still have a really unstable economy because it's built around oil, where we would have the same thing. You could wipe out all these things that people perceive to be the problem, but it wouldn't rearrange our economy. Our economy still is the same. You look at the zombie corporations in Japan. Even if you could wipe out their debt, the zombie corporations are still there. So would anything really change if you just do a couple accounting tricks? Not really. So what Bitcoin does, or what any hard money system does, is it starts from the ground up, and everything that you build on top of this infrastructure, on top of this foundation, is solid. It's secure. It's sustainable. I mean, I know that's a buzzword now with everyone in the the green community and whatnot. But for me, something that's sustainable, number one, is something that is profitable. I know it's a bizarre concept in today's stock market.
Revenues.
It's profitable, but also it doesn't require massive amounts and ever expanding amounts of debt. And money printing and fiat currency. That's sustainable. And so again, my main point is that whether it's a Bitcoin standard, whether it's a gold, anything that fixes these currency units and provides us with natural deflation, a free market economy where entrepreneurs are always producing more efficient goods and services at lower and lower prices, that's where we want to be. And I think looking at this through an optimistic lens, hopefully, I think we could get there. I know we could get there as human beings because we've done it many, many times before. We're very resilient. And I think that's how we kind of come out the other side.
Yeah, and I really think it's shaping out to be Bitcoin that's the solution. Bitcoin really is because you identify the problem exactly in terms of the problem of not having a hard money and how government captures that. And Bitcoin just routes around the way government is able to capture it. And this is why I think, I'm not one of the people who puts a high probability on there being a violent crackdown on Bitcoin, because I think it's just the natural technological limitations of physical gold naturally led to government having the ability to abuse its authority over gold, and then having that ability led to all these institutions that were built around it. But when new technology is created, it creates its own reality, and the world adjusts to it. So people deal with it from a self-interested perspective, and that's eventually what Bitcoin does. That's the cycle of skepticism. You start off thinking, of course this can't work, of course it's going to fail, and then it continues to work, and then you starting to appreciate why it continues to not fail. And then, eventually you understand that there's value related there, and that it's relevant to you, and you could use it yourself.
Yeah, and I think that every day that goes by, as we see more adoption with Bitcoin, the better probability you have that that's the default mechanism. And so many people say, "Oh, we'll never go on a Bitcoin standard. We'll never go on a gold standard again. It will never ever happen. Governments will never choose to go on XYZ standard." But what they're not understanding is it might not be government's choice.
Exactly.
They might not have an alternative.
Yeah, the Roman Empire didn't choose to go out of business.
Exactly. Exactly right. So if you get this gradual adoption, the more time goes on, the more Bitcoin isn't a new thing. It's not a bizarre thing. You don't have these grandmothers like bit what, bit who, what's going on
Yeah.
here. And if you look, I think it's very interesting, and I'm not sure the specific countries in Africa, but I know many of them, the people aren't even using cash. They're just trading their cell phone minutes back and forth on their cell phone or whatever little, I forgot the name of the little unit of exchange, but it just goes back and forth on their cell phone. So although it might not be Bitcoin directly, the bottom line is it's a currency.
Yeah.
It's completely digital that's going back and forth that people are already starting to adopt. And of course, the millennials are doing it. There's, even on your Twitter feed, I know someone was making fun of both of us, calling us boomers. Like, oh, I'm not watching that one. You got two boomers on there, right? Well,
Wow.
but my point is, obviously, it's being more and more adopted by the younger generations. So as those kids get older, it's not so bizarre to them, and that's benefit Bitcoin even more.
Absolutely.
I think you get to that point where governments don't have a choice because of a total loss of confidence in fiat currency.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to sneak in two questions here because you guys are going for 45 minutes on one question, which I love. It's great, but I'm going to sneak two in here.
Making your job easy, huh?
Yeah, exactly. And I want to check in. We're about 15 minutes away or so from the appointed end time. Yeah. So I want to know if you guys can go a little longer than we had planned, or if you have hard cutoff.
I'm fine. Or go ahead and let me look at my calendar here. Are people?
All right, you check it out. All right. So here's the questions to follow up on the question about transitions, right? So we have some chatter in the YouTube chat about central bank digital currencies, like a Fed coin, right?
Yeah.
So Saif, what do you think about the prospects of a Fed coin and, like the competition that it might bring against Bitcoin?
I think ultimately we might get some forms of digitization, more digitization. I think there will be things like that, but ultimately it doesn't really, it's not a digital currency. It's still a national currency because I think, and it's orthogonal to Bitcoin. It's irrelevant to Bitcoin, or I shouldn't say irrelevant. It's different from Bitcoin because it doesn't do anything that Bitcoin does. In particular, there are two things that are distinguishing Bitcoin from current national currencies, which is that Bitcoin's monetary policy is algorithmic. It's not discretionary. Nobody wakes up in the morning and decides what to do with Bitcoin's monetary policy. And also the Bitcoin payment finalization and clearance and settlement is also algorithmic and cryptographic and programmable rather than discretionary. So nobody can nobody can freeze your Bitcoin account. Nobody can confiscate it. So those are the two main functions of central banks. That's why central banks are there, to decide who can pay and who can't pay on the one hand, and secondly, to decide what's going to happen with the monetary policy. And so the notion that central banks would invent a digital currency or introduce a digital currency that takes away those two things, I think is a non-starter. They're not going to put themselves out of business. They're not going to introduce a currency whose supply is algorithmic or whose payment clearance is totally cryptographic. They're still going to want what programmers call God mode. They're still going to want the ability to say, no, you can't send them money. And they're still going to want to set the money supply. So all that they're doing is that they're just making it more digitalized, and therefore hopefully making it as George was saying, getting Bitcoin acceptance into people's minds. So we thank them for the free PR.
Basically like a last gasp, like rebranding of the dollar, basically.
Yeah.
I think Fed coin could get us there a lot faster. And going back to what we were talking about, the collapse of confidence in fiat currency itself. So I don't want to get too wonky on everyone here, but if we create, let's call it a Fed coin, and I actually talked to Ron Paul about this the other day, and basically what would have to happen is everyone would have to have a bank account with the Fed, with bank reserves, just like the primary dealer banks and the banks under the Fed's umbrella.
Yeah.
So because the Fed right now can't really create broad money directly as of right now. I think that may change, but right now they just create base money. I don't want to bore anyone with details, but that's why quantitative easing, they could take it up to 10 trillion, 20 trillion, and it wouldn't necessarily affect consumer prices, because the transfer mechanism there is the debt monetization with the government. If they're not doing that, then it has to be lent out into new money by the commercial banking system. And those bank reserves, they're not lending those out directly. Those only just backstop additional loans and increase the capacity of their balance sheet. Okay, so that's the way it works right now. But I'm thinking that maybe very soon here, because, and we saw this, how cumbersome it was to get out these stimulus checks, that the Fed, because they're thinking, okay, we're going to take on more power. We want more control over the currency and how money is spent, and we want to know where where you're spending every single dollar. We want more and more control over that, whether it's the Fed, the government, just the central planners, let's call them. They want to micromanage everything. So they take that, they set up this Fed coin and say, well, what you have to do is download this app on your phone, and every single month we'll send you these stimulus checks, or UBI, whatever you want to call it, of, let's say, $2,000, and then you can go right to Starbucks and use that on your phone. Okay, well, everyone is going to, my opinion, most people will adopt that because it's free money, and then you are on this Fed coin system. But if we look at the work of Dr. Lacey Hunt, who's one of my favorite economists. He's someone that's really in the deflationary camp, but he says that once you change the Federal Reserve Act to allow the Federal Reserve to change their what he calls their liabilities into actual currency units, into broad money, increase M2 money supply directly, that's where he goes from being a deflationist to someone who sees us being on the path to hyperinflation. Those are his words, not mine. And if you don't know who Lacey Hunt is, not a tinfoil hat guy. He goes all the way back to the Milton Friedman days. He is an OG. He is legit. And you can look him up, Google him for sure. So that's how he sees this. So my point is that by creating this Fed coin, what they're doing is they're getting us on the path to hyperinflation. And the faster we get to hyperinflation, obviously that's by definition a loss of confidence in fiat currency. That's when, as a society, as a global society, we start looking for an alternative, whatever it is. So you see my point. I think they're going to a Fed coin. They'll do it. Obviously, it's not a cryptocurrency. It's just a more digital currency that gives them more control. But I think inadvertently, if they do that, they put us right on the path that will lead to their own destruction.
Potentially.
All right, so here's the second question I was going to ask then, because I didn't get it in. That was my mistake. All right, so we're talking about, how Bitcoin might go global, talking about hyperinflation, hyper-Bitcoinization. We've talked about the path that might be taken to get to a Bitcoin future. So yeah, I wanted to go back to that idea, but ask a more specific question. What country do you guys think will be the first to publicly disclose that they have bought some Bitcoin for their own treasury, their sovereign treasury? Again, remembering that at the top, we talked about how we have macro investors buying in, big investors buying in. We have companies now buying in. Seems like the last kind of stone to fall is, a sovereign nation. Obviously, the game theory says that it's, because it's an asymmetric bet, you could make an asymmetric bet on the future of your, country's power and really rise and increase your country's power on the global stage significantly by accumulating Bitcoin now. So what do you guys think? Saif, you want to start?
I think Venezuela.
Go ahead. Okay.
Because what's their downside? I mean, obviously the guy running the show there is a complete nut, but if you got someone that actually had some sense, then why not start going on let's call it a Bitcoin standard? Because if you look at hyperinflations throughout history, the way you typically get rid of that, like with Zimbabwe as an example, you say, okay, we're just automatically overnight, we're not using this Zimbabwe thing anymore, we're using the dollar. And it's just a change of confidence. Well, who is going to what Venezuelan, and I employ a lot of them in Colombia, so I believe me, they're no fans of what's going on there, to say the least. I mean, it viscerally, it makes them sick when I even talk about it on my videos, you know. But if so, they're going to have this complete loss in anything that the government comes out that even resembles a fiat currency, which just puts them right back in the same position. So why not just say, okay, we're on a Bitcoin standard. We are no longer going to control. I mean, the only other thing they could do is like dollarize something like that. But I don't think Venezuela would do that because they want nothing to do with the U.S. government in that, although Ecuador did it. But I think that's kind of, you know, what have you got to lose? There's no downside. The only thing you have is upside. So why not?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. We know that Venezuela is using Bitcoin. We know that Venezuela, some government department, I think, for passport renewal, they were charging people in Bitcoin because they can't get their money from the regular banking system because they're bankrupt, and they were charging Bitcoin. But I think it's not it's not so much about charging and holding it or using it. It's about holding it for the long term. That's the really interesting thing. And if with a government like Venezuela, it doesn't matter how much Bitcoin they buy and sell and spend. They're going to continue to. I mean, it doesn't matter how much Bitcoin they get in. They're going to continue to spend it, and so they won't really benefit from holding and appreciating in the long run. It's really hard to say. I mean, it's 200 governments or something in the world. It's really hard to say which one of them is going to take the plunge on it. If I were to make a wild guess, I'd say Switzerland, just because they were the ones who had the gold standard for the longest time, and they went off the gold standard the most recently. So perhaps they might be the ones that are most receptive to it.
Yeah. I'd like to dive into talking a little bit about the market narratives in Bitcoin. And we've seen the narrative change quite a bit. Seems like the prevailing narrative now is probably digital gold, in terms of like the widespread view of Bitcoin. So Saif, how do you see Bitcoin narratives evolving as adoption happens and works its way up the S-curve?
I mean, I think it's the main evolution is going to be the one that we mentioned earlier, from asymmetric bet on this happening in over long term into it becoming more and more of a just a boring monetary asset that everybody holds, and that's ultimately it. I think we've seen a lot of narratives come and go, and we're going to continue to see a lot of narratives come and go. That miss the point, but it may just be that hard money is really is just going to be the narrative that is dominant.
Yeah, what I'd be curious to know, and I'm sure you guys have your finger on the pulse of this more than I do, is what is the probability of the tech around Bitcoin advancing to the point where it could legitimately be a medium of exchange? Because correct me if I'm wrong, right now, it's rather cumbersome. The amount of transactions that happen on a daily basis would just completely overwhelm the system, and it would be slow, or the amount of electrical needs, whatnot. But I'm assuming there's tons of people that are trying to figure out workarounds for that.
Yeah, there are, but I think, I mean, it's the thing that I argue in my book is, and that's why the title of my book is The Bitcoin Standard, is that you can't really compare Bitcoin transactions with credit card payments. Bitcoin transactions are final settlement transactions, so you have to compare them with settlement payments across international borders. That's the advantage. So, if I send you a Bitcoin, transaction, and you're in the same room, it costs, let's say, 5 cents, and it takes a few minutes or a couple of hours to confirm. But if I send that same transaction across the world to China, that's also going to cost the same thing. So the transactions that are going to be used in, Bitcoin is going to be used, in my opinion, more as a settlement layer rather than for individual payments. I don't think individuals are going to be using Bitcoin to pay for their coffee. The Bitcoin and scaling limitations, and I show some numbers in my book. Bitcoin does what is it, 500,000 transactions a day or something like that, and Visa does, I think, something like 2 billion. And so it's a completely, even if we improve Bitcoin in all kinds of way, there are limitations because it's decentralized that mean that it'll always be different from Visa. But you can't compare Visa payments to Bitcoin payments, because Visa payments are credit payments. Visa payment is, my credit card goes to your machine and in your shop, and then my bank tells your bank that they're going to settle with them, and then they sort it out, and it takes several weeks for it to finally settle. But a Bitcoin transaction is final. Once you've gotten 6, 10 confirmations, whatever, is going to take a few hours. Once you've gotten a few of these confirmations, then you've gotten to the point where the transaction is completely secure, or, well, completely is obviously a big word, but it's secure and it's irreversible. And so in this regard, I think, in this regard, we need to think of the Bitcoin chain base layer as being similar to physical gold or physical money, in that it's going to be moved around. Central banks will exchange gold and they will exchange physical cash with each other. And banks will move physical cash around, but ultimately the majority of transactions will be done digitally without the physical underlying asset having to move. And I think Bitcoin is going to scale with that. Like, there will be second layer solutions that are settled with the second layer Bitcoin. It's the second on the first layer, settled on the first layer Bitcoin chain.
How do you see the extension of credit if we're on a Bitcoin standard? Because obviously you're not lending, or how does that work? Let me.
My feeling, well, I wouldn't say feeling. I think the way that I think about it is that in that kind of situation where we have hard money and what would happen is that banking would have two functions: deposits, where you pay people in order to store your money for you and have it available for you, and use it to settle payment around the world. And I think this is a very valuable service, that your money is at once safe from theft and also a click of a button away from being sent to China. So you pay people for offering you that service, so deposit banking. And then there's equity banking, in my mind, or equity investment. I don't see the possibility of I don't think credit really makes sense in this world, but I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. I don't see why it wouldn't be a problem. I think deposit banking and equity are all that anybody needs. If you want your money to just remain safe, if you want your money to be there, then you place it, you pay people to store it. Now, if you want your money to earn a return, they can't just store it for you. They have to put it out, which means that there's going to be a risk involved, which means that it's going to be invested. And in a world in which nobody has a money printer and central banks can't bail out banks, I don't see how you can make you can give depositors guarantees on their investment. And if investors or lenders, if lenders are not offered a guarantee on the downside because the central bank can't bail them out, I don't see why they would want to lend with a fixed interest rate rather than just taking equity, which has unlimited upside.
Right. So if I'm hearing you correctly, we're not looking at a fractional reserve system there.
I don't think it would work. I think, Bitcoin fixes the glitch in gold that makes fractional reserve banking work, because gold requires banks and places so much value in banks' ability to clear money that it's almost like it allows them to print money, because they almost have like a monopoly network on banks. And so Bitcoin, by making settlements so cheap and open to anybody and open source and not monopolistic, anybody can set up their own Bitcoin node and settle payments for people all over the world. I think by making it into an open market, it makes it very hard for banks to engage in things like fractional reserve banking or maturity transformation. And that's also something I get into in detail in the fiat standard.
Yeah, I just wonder how that would work with the growth of the economy needing a growth of the money supply, or if it just comes through deflation. Like you're talking about.
Maybe we get 5-10% deflation a year.
Yeah, right. Because that in essence would increase the amount of I want to call them the units of measurement available. Like, let's just say that we had one Bitcoin or had $1. You know, a lot of people say, well, then the economy could never grow, but it could if you just divided the dollar into smaller,
Exactly.
such as pennies, right?
Yeah.
And then everyone that was saving those quarters, or in this case, Bitcoin, they would just get richer and richer and richer just by holding it. So anyway, it's just kind of a thing that I've tried to think through there. I appreciate your feedback.
Yeah, it's an absolutely amazing idea when you think about it, that anybody can have their wealth hold its value and appreciate over time, and that's available for anybody anywhere. And then, if you want to take on extra risk, you then, once you've established an amount of saving that can, that it can protect you from, say, a rainy day or losing your job or whatever, and then you're able to take risk, then you're able to put investments in. But, you'll only invest and take risk once you find something that's extremely compelling as an investment. And I think in that world, we'd only get resources diverted toward really valuable investments that produce value in the long term.
100%. Yeah, we go back to what I was talking about, the sustainable business, because your hurdle rate is so much higher. I mean, think what your hurdle rate is when you're getting a business loan at, call it 3%, fixed rate over 30 years, compared to if your hurdle rate was 10%. I mean, how much stronger would the cash flows of those businesses need to be? So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely.
We had Jeff Booth on a couple of episodes ago with Lynn Alden. In his book, The Price of Tomorrow, he talks a lot about the deflationary forces that technology, brings, that we've actually, like with the fiat standard, been overcoming or suppressing the deflationary forces of technology.
Yeah, I'd agree.
And so, yeah, I think the risk of deflation, like causing some problems, or making, I don't believe in the, the hoarding effect anyway, or bringing the economy to a standstill in any way. But, with the deflationary effects of technology, then it's just like no risk at all of it. I think we're going to see really quick deflation, especially with the hard money economy. Okay, guys, time is up there. I want to respect you guys' time, and we'll wrap it up. So, okay. Any closing words?
No, this has been a fascinating conversation. I appreciate you both for your time and expressing your views. I've learned a lot.
Likewise, thank you. I really enjoyed this as well. And I want to pick your brain about references on a couple of things that you mentioned. The 7% return in the 1890s. If you can give me references on.
I was just using the 4%, 3% deflation to get the 7% real.
Yeah, I'm looking for sources on this and a couple of other things. I'll probably email you about them.
Okay. Yeah, I don't. Let's see. Do you guys have I think you've got my email, don't you?
Yeah, I'll make sure Safe has it.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Thanks so much, guys. And again, you can find Saifedean's work at saifedean.com. That's SAIFEDEAN. And George Gammon at youtube.com/George Gammon. It's been a fantastic episode, guys. Of course, you can start stacking some Bitcoin. I know you want to now. You can go stack some Bitcoin regularly and steadily with automatic recurring buys at swanbitcoin.com. And thanks, everyone.